Welcome to the debate. We are looking at a geopolitical shockwave today. It's an event that has completely rewritten the modern rules of naval warfare.
Yeah, literally overnight.
Exactly. Right now, we are 5 days into an escalating U.S.-Israeli war on Iran, and amidst this multi-front campaign, a United States submarine fired a Mark 48 heavyweight torpedo and sank the Iranian warship, the IRS Dana. But the critical thing here is that this didn't happen in the Persian Gulf. It happened 44 nautical miles off the southern coast of Sri Lanka.
Right, deep in the Indian Ocean.
Yes, thousands of miles from the primary theater of operations.
And I think it's worth pausing just to note the historical gravity of that fact. This marks the first time an enemy ship has been sunk by a torpedo since the Second World War. It is a massive, unprecedented escalation.
It absolutely is. And, that brings us to the core question we have to grapple with today. Is the sinking of the IRS Dina a justified strategic military necessity to cripple an adversary's naval capabilities during an active war?
Or does it constitute an illegal military overreach that dangerously unravels international maritime norms?
Right. And my perspective is that when you are in a declared, active conflict where global stability is quite literally on the line, neutralizing a heavily armed enemy combatant, no matter where it sails, is a fundamental strategic necessity.
And I take a very different view of the international architecture. I'll be arguing that attacking a ship that posed no immediate threat, particularly while it was transiting peacefully in international waters after a diplomatic exercise, is a profound violation of international law. It sets a terrifying precedent that frankly essentially turns the entire globe into a free fire zone.
Well, let's unpack the reality of the conflict we're actually in. We aren't talking about a localized skirmish anymore. We are in the fifth day of a massive military campaign. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has stated unequivocally that wiping out Iran's navy is a primary objective, and we have to be clear about what the IRS Dina actually is.
Sure. This was not a benign patrol boat or a Coast Guard vessel. It was one of Iran's newest Muj-class frigates. For those unfamiliar, a Muj-class frigate is essentially a floating fortress designed for deep ocean operations. It's loaded with surface-to-air missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, and heavy torpedoes.
I don't dispute the vessel's capabilities. It's a warship. But capability does not automatically equal an imminent threat. And that distinction is the absolute bedrock of international law.
But in an act of war, does that distinction really hold? This specific vessel and its defense networks were already sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department back in 2023 for supplying weapons used against civilian targets in Ukraine. It has a track record. In the context of a declared war, the IRS Dana is an inherently legitimate military target. And by taking it out with a Mark 48 torpedo, which, by the way, isn't just a missile that damages a hull, it's designed to detonate under the keel and literally break the back of a ship, the United States demonstrated what Secretary Hegseth called a quiet death capability. When vital economic arteries like the Strait of Hormuz are completely paralyzed by this conflict, projecting that level of absolute naval dominance is the only way to force an adversary to stand down.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the actual geography of this strike? You bring up the Strait of Hormuz, but look at a map. The IRS Dana wasn't in the Strait of Hormuz. It was 44 nautical miles off the coast of Sri Lanka. It was heading home after participating in Milan 2026.
Right.
That is a massive multilateral naval exercise hosted by India, involving 74 different countries. The ship was quite literally returning from a diplomatic mission.
A diplomatic mission for a nation actively engaged in a regional war.
But the location and the posture matter legally. Wes Bryant, the former Pentagon targeting expert, has forcefully pointed this out. The ship was transiting peacefully through Sri Lanka's economic zone. It wasn't attacking. It wasn't positioning its radars for a strike. Under the laws of armed conflict, we rely on the principle of distinction. That means you don't just differentiate between civilians and soldiers. You have to differentiate between active participants in a combat zone and those who are geographically and operationally isolated from the battlefield.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective
Well,
on...
just to finish the thought, when Hegseth dismisses these guardrails as stupid rules of engagement, he's effectively saying that the entirety of a nation's government and military is an imminent threat, 24/7, anywhere on the planet.
Let me ask you this, though. How do you reconcile the U.S. need for deterrence with that legal framework? Because the way I see it, the idea of an imminent threat fundamentally changes when a state of war exists. In a counterterrorism operation against an insurgency, yes, you wait for an imminent threat. But in a multi-front state-on-state war, enemy warships don't get a magical safe zone just because they've sailed far enough away from the Middle East or because they just shook hands at a naval drill.
They get a safe zone because they are operating in the shared global commons, far removed from the theater of hostilities. It reminds me of how submarine warfare completely upended the rules during World War I and II. Suddenly, the threat wasn't just what you could see on the horizon. It was an unseen killer. The international community spent decades after 1945 building maritime laws precisely to prevent the oceans from reverting to that kind of lawless, predatory environment.
But naval warfare is inherently global. You're talking about a nation with a blue water naval capacity. Blue water means they have the logistics and the hull strength to project power across the open ocean, far from their own shores. If the U.S. allows a heavily armed capital ship like the IRS Diana to casually sail back to port, rearm, and then deploy into the Persian Gulf to kill American sailors, that would be a dereliction of strategic duty.
I hear the strategic logic, I really do. But we have to look at the human and geopolitical fallout of turning the Indian Ocean into a battlefield. Let's look at what actually happened on the ground in Galle, Sri Lanka. You've got the Sri Lankan Coast Guard getting a frantic distress call at 5:08 in the morning. Their navy, adhering to international maritime obligations, sails out into a shared search and rescue zone. They're expecting to conduct a standard rescue. Instead, they find nothing but oil slicks, debris, and sailors floating in the water. They pulled 87 bodies from the ocean.
It is a profound tragedy. The recovery efforts by the Sri Lankan Navy were commendable, and the loss of life is the grim reality of this escalation.
It's more than a tragedy. It's a massive destabilization of a neutral nation. Sri Lanka had to transport 32 survivors, many in critical condition, to the National Hospital in Galle. They literally had to turn a regional civilian medical facility into a makeshift military mortuary, guarded by local police. Another 61 sailors are still missing. This shows us the terrifying new reality of modern warfare. There are no localized conflicts anymore. A war in the Middle East can instantly drag a developing neutral nation in South Asia into the trauma and logistical nightmare of a mass casualty event. New Delhi and Colombo are deeply alarmed, and rightfully so.
They are alarmed, and no one is minimizing the burden placed on Sri Lanka. But if we are talking about the new reality of modern warfare, we have to look at the global economic context. You mentioned earlier that the conflict should be geographically contained, but the economic impact of Iran's posture certainly isn't contained. As we sit here, the Strait of Hormuz is functionally paralyzed. A massive percentage of the world's oil flows through that narrow choke point. Global trade is choking. We are looking at imminent supply chain disruptions that will skyrocket the prices of essential goods, electronics, and medicine globally.
So the solution to global instability is to launch torpedoes in international waters?
The solution to global instability is a swift, decisive conclusion to the war. The United States and its coalition partners do not have the luxury of engaging in a slow, geographically contained war of attrition while the global economy bleeds out. Here is the harsh calculus. Overwhelming, absolute military action striking high-value targets like the Daylana, wherever they are, is the fastest way to degrade the enemy's capacity to fight. The ultimate responsibility for those casualties in Galle lies with the government in Tehran that escalated this conflict to the point where global shipping is held hostage.
That is a very dangerous rationale. Saying they started it so the rules no longer apply is how you unravel the Geneva Conventions entirely. And the way this strike was executed points to an even deeper level of escalation. It wasn't just a sinking, it was a psychological operation.
You're talking about the footage released by the Department of War?
Exactly. They didn't just sink the ship. They released near real-time, black and white periscope footage of the kill on the Platform X. But let's look at the technology behind that kill. A senior Sri Lankan official noted that through back channels, the Iranian embassy claimed the IRS Dina's defenses were disabled by electromagnetic means before the torpedo was even fired.
Which
if true, is a staggering testament to U.S. tactical dominance.
It's an example of profound technological asymmetry. They allegedly blinded the ship's sensors electronically, turning a state-of-the-art frigate into a sitting duck, and then broadcast its sheer destruction to the entire world on social media. You view that as deterrence. I view it as practically inviting uncontrollable blowback.
How so? If an adversary realizes their million-dollar warships can be blinded and sunk without even detecting a threat at periscope depth, the logical response is to realize the war is unwinnable. Secretary Hegseth noted 17 Iranian vessels have already been sunk. The message is clear: there is no safe harbor. But human history tells us that when an adversary is backed into a corner and realizes they cannot fight you conventionally, they do not simply surrender. They turn to desperate asymmetric retaliation. We are already seeing the blowback from this exact strategy. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps isn't suing for peace. They've announced they will continue missile and drone strikes across the entire region. We've already seen missiles intercepted over Turkey, which threatens NATO airspace. We have 100,000 civilians fleeing Tehran in panic. By flaunting this absolute technological dominance and completely discarding the rules of engagement, the U.S. coalition is forcing Iran into unaccountable asymmetric warfare. I think we have to separate the short-term tactical reactions from the long-term strategic reality. Yes, when you dismantle a conventional military apparatus, you will see a spike in asymmetric, desperate responses. That is expected. But deterrence theory relies on fundamentally breaking the adversary's ability to project sustained power. If Iran loses its blue water navy, if its capital ships are sitting on the bottom of the Indian Ocean, they physically cannot threaten global shipping lanes the way they could a week ago.
But they don't need a blue water navy to cause chaos if they feel the conventional rules of war are already dead.
Orosis, the rules of war are intended to govern hostilities, not to provide a suicide pact for nations facing an adversary that explicitly uses its military to disrupt the global order. The Iranian leadership is watching their prized assets eliminated with absolute impunity. They are seeing that the U.S. has the stealth, the electromagnetic dominance, and the political will to systematically dismantle them. Eventually, the lack of conventional infrastructure removes their ability to sustain the conflict. The goal here isn't a fair fight on the open ocean. The goal is to secure a definitive victory that restores stability.
I understand the theory, but let's synthesize what this actually means for the future of global security. This is the core takeaway for anyone watching this unfold. If we redefine imminent threat to mean the mere existence of an adversary's military asset anywhere on Earth, we are handing a loaded gun to every other superpower. What happens when another global power adopts this exact same doctrine?
You're referring to other potential flashpoints?
I'm referring to the South China Sea, the Mediterranean, the Arctic. If the United States establishes the precedent that you can unilaterally torpedo a vessel returning from a multinational exercise, and you justify it by saying they are a hostile nation and we are in a conflict, then what stops another nation from deciding a U.S. allied ship is an inherent target in their own localized dispute? The guardrails of civilization only work when the most powerful nations agree to be bound by them. By abandoning them for a short-term tactical victory, the long-term damage to international law is catastrophic.
I hear your concern about precedent, but I look at the precedent being set right now as one of absolute consequence for aggression. We are living through a high-intensity conflict that has paralyzed one of the most vital waterways on Earth. In that context, the sinking of the IRS Dina is an undeniably harsh but fully justified demonstration of military power. The vessel was a heavily armed combatant. It belonged to a hostile nation actively engaged in a war that is choking global trade. By demonstrating the capability to deliver a quiet death via a heavyweight torpedo anywhere on the globe, the U.S. is exerting the overwhelming pressure required to force an end to these hostilities. The collateral impact on Sri Lanka is tragic, but neutralizing enemy capabilities is the prerequisite for returning the world to actual stability.
And I maintain that the execution of this strike crosses an unprecedented line. Sinking a warship that posed no immediate threat while it was transiting international waters in a shared search and rescue zone violates the core principles of military necessity. Treating the entire globe as a battlefield, broadcasting the kills online, and dismissing established maritime laws doesn't create stability. It risks massive asymmetric blowback, inflicts deep trauma on neutral nations like Sri Lanka, and sets a terrifying precedent for how the next great power conflict will be fought. It is a dangerous overreach that we will be paying the price for long after this specific war ends.
The one thing we can absolutely agree on is that the geopolitical and economic shockwaves of this single torpedo strike will be felt for years. From the devastating recovery efforts in Galay to the paralyzed shipping lanes in the Middle East, the consequences extend far beyond the Indian Ocean.
Completely. We leave it to you, our listeners, to weigh the balance here. Is the pursuit of a decisive, overwhelming military strategy worth the potential unraveling of international maritime norms? As this conflict continues to expand, the long-term implications for global security are anything but settled, and we will be watching closely as it develops.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.